There are names in history that flicker like distant candles, barely remembered outside the dusty volumes of genealogy. Yet behind those faint flames are lives twisted by ambition, duty, and the unrelenting cruelty of bloodlines. One such life was that of Margarita Teresa of Spain, a princess celebrated in portraits, but condemned by the very dynasty that gave her birth. Her fate was not written in glory, but in the suffocating ink of a family obsessed with purity, power, and tradition. Before we descend into her story, remember history is darker than we imagine. If you wish to uncover more of these unsettling truths, subscribe to Dark Hours Archive and step deeper into the shadows of the past. Margarita Teresa's existence began not as a promise of freedom, but as an instrument of design. Born in Madrid in 1651, she was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. In the gilded halls of the palace, her arrival was not celebrated for her individuality or her potential, but for what her blood could secure. Her very conception was not the product of a wide-reaching union between nations, but the tightening of a family not already choking itself. Philip and Mariana were uncle and niece. Such was the norm within the Habsburg dynasty, where the walls of power were kept high and the gates locked to outsiders. The child grew beneath chandeliers and beneath the scrutiny of eyes that saw her not as a girl but as a vessel. To her family, Margarita Teresa was not just a daughter, she was the embodiment of dynastic survival. Her small hands would never be free to choose. They were already chained to treaties, to inheritances, to vows she had never spoken. Her earliest years unfolded like a play staged for others. She was adored, yes, but adored like a relic in a chapel, precious, fragile, untouchable. Servants tended to her every need, courtiers marveled at her delicate features, and artists captured her likeness in paintings meant to reassure Europe that the Spanish crown still held beauty and youth within its tired blood. Diego Velázquez, the master painter of Philip's court, immortalized her in canvases that today hang in great museums. Yet even those portraits, with their elaborate gowns and intricate lace, betray a certain unease. The child stares out with wide eyes, luminous yet heavy, as though already aware of the weight of destiny pressing upon her shoulders. Behind those silks and pearls, however, reality crept in. The Spanish Empire was a shadow of its former glory. Wars drained the treasury, famine gnawed at the people, and the once mighty Armada was a ghost of itself. The court, glittering as it seemed, was haunted by decline. Margarita Teresa was born not into triumph, but into decay. Every banquet, every procession, every ornate detail of her attire was not so much a celebration as a desperate performance, designed to mask the cracks in an empire falling apart. Her family, the Habsburgs, clung to an ancient belief that their survival depended on blood remaining pure within their own circle. To marry beyond those sacred boundaries was to invite corruption, and so, with each generation, the family tree grew more tangled, its branches wrapping back upon themselves. For Margarita Teresa, this meant that from the moment she first opened her eyes, her future husband had already been chosen, not just any man, but her own uncle, Leopold I, the future Holy Roman Emperor. As a child, she could not understand the bargain already written into her life, but the courtiers did, her mother did, her father most certainly did. For them, Margarita Teresa was a chess piece on a board that stretched from Madrid to Vienna. Her laughter in the palace gardens, her education in languages, her endless lessons in courtly manners, these were not for her own flourishing, but for her eventual role as the glue between two crumbling empires. The court adored her. They called her La Joya de la Casa Real, the jewel of the royal house, painted her again and again, as though trying to capture every stage of her transformation from child to bride. But beneath that adoration was calculation. Every step she took was rehearsed, every gesture scrutinized. When she curtsied, she did so not as a child mimicking her elders, but as a queen in waiting, preparing for a role that carried both unimaginable privilege and unimaginable doom. And yet, despite the lavish attention, she was not free. The palace was a prison gilded in gold. Beyond its walls, the streets of Madrid echoed with hunger and discontent, but Margarita Teresa would never walk them. Her world was confined to the chambers of power, where whispers of treaties and wars replaced lullabies, and where the crown weighed heavier than any toy. As she grew, the reality of her fate became clearer. Tutors and courtiers spoke to her of Vienna, of her uncle across the Alps, of the destiny that awaited her not in Spain, but in the empire of the Germans. Letters began to flow between Madrid and Vienna, each word stitching tighter the noose of inevitability. Her childhood was not measured in years, but in steps toward the altar where her autonomy would be sacrificed in the name of dynasty. The tragedy of Margarita Teresa is not that she was unloved. She was, in her own way, cherished, but she was cherished as one cherishes a chalice or a crown, for what it represents, not for what it feels. Every smile she offered was claimed by politics, every breath by legacy, and as she looked out from the balconies of the palace, she might have seen the wide expanse of Spain stretching into horizon. But she knew, perhaps even as a girl, that she would never belong to herself. This was the beginning of her fate, a life painted in oils and framed in gold, yet written in sorrow. A child raised not for freedom, but for marriage to an uncle, and through him, the continuation of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own blood. As Margarita Teresa grew into her early adolescence, the boundaries of her world became both more dazzling and more suffocating. From the outside, hers was a life of wonder, golden halls, endless processions, a retinue of servants who ensured that she never lifted a finger. Yet inside those very walls she learned a darker truth. Every fragment of her identity, from her smile to the way she held her fan, belonged to the dynasty and not to herself. In the Palace of Madrid, routines were rigid. At dawn she was dressed by attendants, layer upon layer of fabric wrapping her like a cocoon. The gowns, stiff with brocade and embroidered with threads of silver, weighed almost as much as the girl herself. Every detail of her attire was deliberate, chosen not for comfort, but for symbolism. She was a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs were meant to be seen as unearthly, untouchable, embodiments of a power that did not bend to the ordinary rhythms of life. Her tutors were chosen carefully, drawn from among the most loyal of the court. They instructed her in Latin, French, and German, in etiquette, in history, and in the endless rituals of Catholic devotion. But none of these lessons were truly hers to claim. They were rehearsals for her role in Vienna. With each passing year, her mind was shaped less by her own curiosity and more by the weight of expectation. And yet, beneath the surface of all this preparation, whispers circulated. The Habsburg line was failing. Centuries of marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, had weakened the dynasty's blood. Her own half-brother, Charles II of Spain, would one day inherit the throne, a boy already marked by frailty, whose birth was seen less as a promise and more as an omen. Margarita Teresa could not have known the medical words we use today, but she saw the truth with her own eyes. Her brother's sickly frame, his halting speech, his pale complexion. He was the embodiment of a dynasty cracking under the pressure of its own obsession with purity. The courtiers looked to Margarita Teresa differently because of this. She was not just a daughter anymore, she was a possible salvation. If her brother faltered, she might inherit Spain. If her marriage to Leopold proved fruitful, she might secure the empire itself. The double weight pressed down upon her fragile shoulders, though outwardly, she was still only a girl, painted in glowing colors by and celebrated in courtly festivals. But those portraits conceal as much as they reveal. Look closely and one can see it, the stiffness of her posture, the distant look in her eyes. She is dressed like a queen, though still a child. She is surrounded by symbols of joy, yet her expression is grave. Whether he intended it or not, captured the paradox of her existence. She was both central and invisible, central to the survival of the Habsburgs, but invisible as an individual with her own desires. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, understood the stakes all too well. She herself was the product of this system, married to her uncle, and had lived the contradictions of being both cherished and used. Mariana poured her attention into Margarita Teresa, but not in the way of ordinary mothers. She loved her daughter fiercely, yet every gesture of affection was tinged with the knowledge of what awaited her. She whispered to her of duty, of sacrifice, of God's will. It was not cruelty, it was resignation. In that palace, no one could imagine a different path. As the girl approached her teenage years, letters from Vienna became more frequent. They were addressed to her mother and father, but the subject was always Margarita Teresa. Her uncle Leopold I wrote with formality and with patience. He was already preparing for their union, though the girl was still only 12, 13, 14. Every word was heavy with inevitability. He was not merely her uncle, he was her future. The tension between Madrid and Vienna was more than familial. Spain was crumbling. Its empire stretched thin across oceans, drained by wars it could not win. Austria, though also beset with enemies, was seen as the sturdier branch of the family tree. For the Habsburgs, the union of Margarita Teresa and Leopold was not just about tradition, it was about survival. To marry her uncle was to attempt to bind two faltering empires into one desperate alliance. And so, even her play became political. When she danced in the palace halls during festivals, it was as much a rehearsal for her bridal duties as it was a celebration. When she smiled, it was noted by courtiers, who wrote to Vienna of her health, her beauty, her demeanor. She was evaluated constantly, her every gesture transformed into data for a dynastic transaction. The girl who once played with dolls now played with symbols. Instead of toys, she held rosaries. Instead of childish games, she participated in solemn processions. Her world narrowed, and with each narrowing, her freedom dissolved. Still, she found small rebellious glimpses of a soul that refused to be entirely erased. Servants recalled her laughter echoing through the palace, her fondness for small animals in the royal gardens, her moments of genuine curiosity in her lessons. These fragments reveal a child who still sought joy even as the shadow of her fate grew longer each day. But time in the court of Madrid did not wait for joy. By the age of 15, Margarita Teresa was no longer spoken of as a child. She was a bride in waiting, her body the subject of speculation, her fertility the topic of letters exchanged across kingdoms. It was not indecency, it was calculation. Every noble family watched closely, knowing that her womb might decide the fate of empires. The girl who had been called the jewel of the royal house now shone brighter than ever in the eyes of Europe. But like a jewel, she was also cold, faceless, and set into a crown not of her choosing. The walls of her palace, decorated with frescoes and tapestries, became tighter than ever. They were walls of silk and marble, but they were also bars of a prison. She was adored, but she was not free. She was prepared, but she was not allowed to choose. She was celebrated, but only as a vessel. By the mid-1660s, when she was barely 16, the marriage contract was finalized. The letters became declarations. The courtiers became messengers of certainty. The stage was set for the next act of her life, the departure from Spain, the crossing of mountains, and the binding of her fate to the uncle she had never been allowed to refuse. This was the tragedy of her adolescence. A childhood smothered by expectation, a youth stolen by politics, a heart shackled before it could even choose to beat freely. In every portrait painted of her, in every description written by courtiers, one can see the paradox. She glows like royalty, yet behind the glow there is only the dim light of captivity. Her golden cage was almost ready to open, not to release her into freedom, but to deliver her into another prison, one even colder, even farther from the world she knew. In the year 1666, the court of Madrid prepared itself for a spectacle unlike any other. The marriage of Princess Margarita Teresa to her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. The date, the clothes, the ceremonies all were chosen with a precision that revealed the gravity of what was at stake. To the Spanish, this was a moment of hope, a desperate tether binding them to their Austrian kin. To the Austrians, it was a necessary reinforcement of bloodlines and power. To Margarita Teresa was the end of her fragile adolescence, and the beginning of a life she had never chosen. The announcement was met with fanfare across Europe. Pamphlets spread the news. Painters immortalized her as the young bride-to-be. Yet beneath the gilded surface of celebration, everyone knew the truth. She was barely 15, a girl whose innocence was being wrapped in bridal silks, while her groom, her own uncle, was 36, a ruler already hardened by years of war, intrigue, and loss. The dynastic game required no disguises. This was not a marriage of love, but of calculation. On the morning of the ceremony in Madrid, the palace was draped in gold and crimson. Bells rang across the city, summoning nobles, courtiers, and clergy to witness the union. Margarita Teresa, dressed in a gown heavy with pearls and stiff embroidery, walked with the solemnity of one already burdened by her crown. Witnesses wrote that her beauty shone like light breaking through a storm, but even they could not ignore the shadow in her eyes. She was too young, too fragile, yet she carried herself with the dignity of one who understood she could not resist. For the people of Madrid, the wedding was bittersweet. Their princess, painted by as the glowing child of Las Meninas, was leaving them. She would no longer be the jewel of Spain, but the empress of distant Vienna. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving, crying, throwing flowers into her path. Some cheered, others mourned quietly, sensing that this departure was final. The contract was signed, the vows exchanged, and with it, Margarita Teresa's fate was sealed. She was now the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire by title, exalted above almost any woman in Europe, yet by reality diminished into the role of a pawn. Her departure from Spain was itself a ritual of separation. With a retinue of guards, servants, and noble companions, she was carried across the mountains, leaving behind the sunlit courtyards of Madrid for the colder, sterner lands of Central Europe. Each mile placed more distance between her and the only home she had ever known. Letters reveal that she wept often during the journey, clutching the tokens given to her by her mother. But no amount of tears could alter her destination. When she arrived in Vienna, she was greeted with celebrations orchestrated to project majesty. Leopold awaited her, dressed in the imperial regalia of his house. To the crowds, it was a moment of triumph, a unification of two halves of the Habsburg dynasty. To Margarita Teresa was an alien world. The language was unfamiliar, the customs strange, the faces of her new attendants unreadable. She was expected to adapt quickly, to smile graciously, to embody the role of empress with no hesitation. Leopold himself was not unkind, at least not in the way one might expect. He treated her with formality, with the reverence due to his new wife, but their relationship was steeped in inequality. He was her elder, her superior in rank, her guardian and her husband all at once. He had lived decades of adult life before she had even reached womanhood. Their union was less a marriage and more a coronation of dynastic continuity. The court of Vienna soon learned that their young empress carried a quiet sorrow within her. Though she performed her duties appearing in ceremonies, patronizing religious orders, lending her presence to festivals, she remained distant, withdrawn. Observers remarked on her pale complexion, her delicate frame, her expressions of fatigue. It was as though the weight of expectation drained her body as much as her spirit. She bore herself with dignity, but beneath the silks and jewels was a girl trapped in a role that had consumed her entirely. Even her leisure was scripted. Music to enjoy, books to read, prayers to recite. Behind closed doors, she confided to her ladies-in-waiting that she missed Spain, its warmth, its language, its familiar rhythms. Vienna was colder in every sense, and in its marble halls she was lonelier than ever. The marriage soon produced the results the dynasty desired. Margarita Teresa became pregnant, her youth giving way to the exhaustion of childbirth. She delivered children who were celebrated as symbols of dynastic survival, though only a few would live beyond infancy. Each birth was another test upon her fragile body, each loss another crack in her spirit. The court celebrated her as a mother, but she herself remained a daughter at heart, a child who had never truly been allowed to grow up. Leopold, for his part, continued to treat her with ceremonial reverence. He commissioned portraits of her, glorifying her as the embodiment of virtue and dynasty. Yet these portraits, much like those painted in Madrid, reveal the same haunting paradox. She is clothed in majesty, but her eyes are tired, her gaze distant. She shines with the light of empire, but behind that light flickers only sorrow. Her presence in Vienna became a kind of ghostly symbol. She was adored by the people, respected by the nobles, but never known as a human being. She was empress, bride, and mother, yet never Margarita Teresa. As the years passed, the strain upon her health grew worse. Letters describe her frequent illnesses, her fatigue, her bouts of melancholy. Physicians prescribed tonics and prayers, but no remedy could cure the deeper wound, the suffocating cage of dynastic duty. She was only in her late teens, but already she bore the weariness of a woman twice her age. By the age of 20, Margarita Teresa was visibly weakened. The endless pregnancies, the stress of her role, the distance from her homeland, all had carved their toll. She had fulfilled her duty, yet the cost was her youth, her vitality, and her very sense of self. Still, she carried on, attending court, appearing beside her husband, maintaining the facade that her life was one of triumph rather than tragedy. But those who looked closely saw the truth. Behind the jewels and titles, the empress was fading. By the time Margarita Teresa entered her early 20s, the fragile balance of her existence had begun to collapse. What had once been described as delicate beauty now looked more like illness. Her skin, pale as ivory, often appeared almost translucent. Court physicians noted her constant fatigue, her difficulty in recovering from each childbirth, and her recurring fevers. She was, after all, not only an empress but also a young woman trapped in a cycle of pregnancies that her frail body could not sustain. The Habsburgs had long been plagued by the curse of their own blood. Generations of intermarriage had narrowed their gene pool, weakening their descendants and making them prone to deformities, infertility, and early death. Margarita Teresa, born into this web of dynastic pride, carried those marks silently in her body. Every child she bore, sometimes celebrated with fireworks in Vienna's streets, was another wound to her health. Some of her children survived only a few days, others never left infancy. Each funeral bell that tolled in Vienna's cathedrals, echoed like a cruel reminder that the price of royal continuity was personal devastation. Despite her failing health, the expectations placed upon her never lessened. She was expected to smile at court functions, to appear radiant at religious ceremonies, to embody grace in every portrait painted of her. The burden was relentless. In letters to her mother, Queen Mariana of Spain, she confessed that she was often too weak to stand for long audiences, and yet she was pushed forward, draped in heavy gowns and adorned with jewels, because appearances mattered more than her life. The Viennese courtiers, while respectful, began to notice her frailty. They whispered about how thin she had become, how she seemed to drift like a ghost through the grand halls of the Habsburg palace. Some pitied her, others saw her simply as another Habsburg sacrificed to the machinery of dynasty. Her husband, Leopold I, appeared affectionate in public, often depicted as the dutiful spouse, but his affection could not protect her from the reality of her fate. His role as emperor demanded heirs, and Margarita Teresa's role was to provide them, regardless of the toll. Their marriage was both her crown and her chain, binding her to a life that drained her more with each passing year. By 1670, the signs of decline were unmistakable. Margarita Teresa was only 20 years old, yet she walked with the heaviness of someone decades older. The court doctors prescribed endless remedies, tonics made from herbs, ritual prayers, pilgrimages to holy sites. None of it helped. Her body, worn down by repeated childbirth and weakened by the legacy of inbreeding, was failing. She became increasingly withdrawn. Where once she had appeared at festivals and processions, she now often remained confined to her chambers. When she did appear, her attendants noted the effort it took for her to climb into the carriage, the way she leaned heavily on her ladies-in-waiting, the tremor in her hands as she held the rosary beads that rarely left her fingers. The Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, once painted as the radiant Princess of Spain, was fading before her court's eyes, and yet, rather than addressing the tragedy unfolding in their midst, those around her continued to focus on appearances. Portraits commissioned during these final years still show her in full regalia, jeweled gowns, elaborate hairstyles, a serene expression painted onto her face. But anyone who saw her in person knew the truth. The girl who had once been the bright hope of two dynasties was little more than a shadow. In 1673, Margarita Teresa gave birth to her last child. The pregnancy had been fraught with complications, and her recovery was slow and painful. Court records describe her as wasting away, her strength diminished to the point that she could scarcely rise from her bed. Even then, pressure mounted for her to continue her duties, to at least appear at religious ceremonies when possible. She did so, though every step was agony. By the age of 21, her body could endure no more. In July 1673, she succumbed to what was described as a mortal weakness, a vague term used in chronicles of the time. In truth, it was a culmination of years of strain, her frail genetics, her repeated pregnancies, her ceaseless duties, and the relentless weight of dynastic expectations. She died in Vienna, far from the warm sun of her native Spain, leaving behind only a handful of children, most of whom would not survive to adulthood. Her death cast a pall over the imperial court. Bells tolled in Vienna, black drapes covered palace halls, and memorial masses were held. Yet the grief was tinged with practicality. Chroniclers recorded her passing as a dynastic loss, emphasizing the difficulty it posed for Leopold I's succession plans, rather than mourning her as a woman. In Spain, however, the reaction was sharper, more emotional. Margarita Teresa had been their beloved infanta, immortalized in Inés' masterpiece Las Meninas. To hear that she had died so young, so far from home, stirred sorrow and resentment. Songs and poems lamented her fate, framing her as a victim of dynastic ambition, a girl who had been used and discarded by the politics of kings. Her body was interred in the imperial crypt of Vienna, among the cold tombs of her Habsburg ancestors. There she rests, a silent testament to the cost of a dynasty that devoured its own children in the name of power. Visitors to the crypt see her sarcophagus lined among emperors and empresses, but her story stands apart. She was not remembered for great conquests, nor for ruling with an iron hand. She was remembered for being a sacrifice, an empress who had never lived long enough to truly rule. A princess raised not for her own destiny, but for the destiny of her bloodline. Even in death, her image was manipulated. Painters captured her likeness in memorial portraits, idealizing her youth and beauty, smoothing away the evidence of her decline. She became, once more, a symbol forever frozen in time as the radiant child of Madrid and the tragic young Empress of Vienna. Her brief life was a story of inevitability. From the moment she was born, her path was already charted, to marry within her family, to strengthen the dynasty, to bear heirs, and to die before her time. Her fate was not an accident, but the deliberate result of choices made by kings and queens who saw children not as individuals, but as tools of policy. And so, the story of Margarita Teresa serves as one of the darkest parables of dynastic Europe. She was not alone. Many Habsburgs suffered similar fates: short lives, physical ailments, and untimely deaths. But hers is perhaps the most poignant, because her face had already been immortalized in one of the greatest paintings of all time. Generations who looked upon Las Meninas saw the child who once enchanted Madrid, and when they learned of her fate, they understood the price of that enchantment. Her life ended at 21, but her story lived on, woven into the narrative of Habsburg decline. She became, in memory, a tragic icon, a reminder of how power can twist even the most innocent lives, and how the crown that glittered so brightly could, in truth, be nothing more than a gilded cage. Margarita Teresa's death at the age of just 21 was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend, the shaping of her memory into something larger, darker, and more symbolic than her brief life had allowed. Her passing was mourned, yes, but it was also quickly folded into the larger narrative of the Habsburg dynasty, a tale of grandeur mixed with decay, of crowns that glittered but crushed those who wore them. Her children, the supposed justification for all her suffering, did not secure the dynasty as intended. Several died young, as had been the fate of so many Habsburg offspring. The only one who carried her line forward was Maria Antonia of Austria, her daughter, who herself would live only to the age of 23, worn down by the same frailties. The cycle repeated, as if inescapable, each generation paying the same price for the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity. The Habsburgs themselves never publicly admitted the cost of their choices. They continued their tradition of intermarriage, believing that dynastic strength outweighed the risks. But to those who looked closer, Margarita Teresa became a cautionary figure, vivid reminder of what happened when power was valued above life, when a girl was raised not for herself, but for the dynasty. Her image remained powerful, largely because of painting, Las Meninas. In that masterpiece, she is the luminous center, surrounded by courtiers, her gaze capturing viewers across centuries. People who stood before the canvas in Madrid whispered about her tragic fate, about the child who had grown into an empress only to die before her prime. The painting became not just art but prophecy, her bright presence in the picture forever contrasted with the darkness of her destiny. In Spain, her death reinforced the sense of decline that haunted the Habsburg monarchy. The great empire that had once stretched across continents was beginning to fracture, weakened not only by wars and debt, but by the very bloodlines meant to sustain it. Margarita Teresa, who had been sent away to strengthen the dynasty, instead came to embody its fragility. In Austria, too, her memory lingered. Visitors to the imperial crypt, standing among the marble and stone of the Habsburg tombs, paused at her resting place. Guides spoke of the young empress who had married her uncle, who had been painted as a child of promise, who had withered under the demands of power. She became part of Vienna's whispered lore, a figure whose tragedy gave weight to the grandeur of the Hofburg and the imperial legacy. Yet, beyond the courts, beyond the crypts and portraits, her story carried a deeper meaning. It was the story of a child caught in the machinery of empire. From her first steps in the glittering halls of Madrid, she had never belonged to herself. Every smile was for the dynasty, every lesson a preparation for marriage, every breath measured against the needs of the crown. She had been consumed by the role imposed upon her, and in that sense, her life was not unique. It was a mirror of countless royal daughters who were born not to live, but to serve. Her fate also foreshadowed the collapse of her bloodline. Less than half a century after her death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs would come to an end with the death of her younger brother. Charles II, the infamous bewitched king whose severe disabilities and childlessness were the final toll of centuries of intermarriage. When the dynasty fell, historians looked back to Margarita Teresa and saw her as part of the chain of inevitability. The bright princess sacrificed to a failing system. The tragedy of Margarita Teresa continues to resonate because it is not only a personal story but a political one. She was not simply a young woman who died too soon, she was the embodiment of the dangers of dynastic obsession. The proof that even empires can rot from within when their rulers refuse to see beyond their own narrow vision of power. Her life was a candle burned too quickly, and her death was a warning that the glittering crowns of Europe often rested on broken foundations. Today, her story is remembered not with grandeur but with sorrow. In the galleries of the Prado Museum, tourists gaze upon her portrait in Las Meninas and see the innocence of a child who had no idea of the path before her. In Vienna, the crypt where she lies still attracts visitors who trace her name with their fingers and wonder about the life she lost. The lesson of Margarita Teresa is stark. Power devours its own. The very bloodline that exalted her also condemned her. She was born into privilege, yet denied the simplest of freedoms to grow, to love, to live for herself. In the end, her legacy is not one of triumph, but of caution. She stands as a haunting figure in the annals of royal history, a reminder that behind the silks and jewels were fragile bodies and hearts that could not endure the weight of a dynasty's ambitions. And so, when we remember Margarita Teresa, we remember not just the Princess of Las Meninas, or the Empress of Vienna. We remember the girl whose life was traded for political advantage, the young woman whose health was sacrificed for heirs who would not survive, the empress who died before her time. She is both a victim and a symbol of beauty, of tragedy, and of the terrible cost of empire. If this story of Margarita Teresa's dark fate has unsettled you, it is because history itself often hides the most haunting truths behind gilded portraits and royal titles. This was not merely the tale of a single princess, but of an entire dynasty slowly collapsing under the weight of its own choices. If you want to explore more stories like this, tales of power, cruelty, and the hidden tragedies of history, make sure you subscribe to our channel. Every week we uncover the shadows of the past and reveal the human cost of empire. Subscribe now so you never miss the next descent into history's darkest corners.